So this is like new thoughts that I had, mostly like coming out of WrestleMania weekend. So I went there and I saw a few shows, and I've been thinking for a while, like I feel like there's a criteria of stuff that gets you over. Especially there's this group of stuff that gets you over today that I don't feel like anybody talks about or anybody describes to students. And in my opinion, and I might be a little cynical, but I think there's a lot of the problem is we've only ever been taught this stuff in the blue, which I would call like the traditional rules or the traditional tools of wrestling, which you've heard, like especially a lot of older trainers who are very experienced and very successful in a lot of different ways in wrestling, as whether it's as trainers or as wrestlers or as bookers or whatever. They tell us these things a lot. These are the things that will get you over, we're told. Personality and charisma and promos. Having good fundamentals, which is what we're starting to learn here. Things like getting heat, if you're a heel especially, if you want to get heat so that the babyface will have a good comeback on you, the people care about the babyface's comeback. Things like slowing it down and not rushing through your stuff so that, to make a long story short, it can resonate with an audience. Selling and getting sympathy, which is what the babyface especially wants to do, or what the heel wants to do to make sure the babyface's stuff gets over. Getting the most out of the least. You hear a lot of people say, less is more. Slow it down, less is more. And I think that just means being more efficient. I've mixed these two up. These should be on other sides. And then I think ultimately, and I'll explain why I've put these in both sides, is people really care about a finish. Ultimately, you're trying to make people care about a winner and a loser. Typically, you're trying to make people want a babyface to win or want to see the heel to lose, or both. So, in my opinion, we've been taught all of these things, but I've never heard anybody describe these things. And I think as time has gone on, the wrestling audience has changed. And especially like when you go to like WrestleMania weekend, and it's world travelers from all over, it's a very knowledgeable group of fans there, right? It's like, it's not the same as, say, a house show. If they ran a house show downtown, it might be more of a kids crowd or a family crowd. There will be some young adults there too, with Bullet Club shirts or whatever. Or I think like, when we go to promotions, you guys might not know these promotions yet, but STW in the Southern Tier, Nickel City, from what I've heard, is like that. So I would say, like, here are some promotions, examples of local promotions that I think this stuff you can get over really well in these promotions. Hell, you can get over anywhere if you do this stuff really well, especially this one. If you have a personality and charisma that connects with people, everything else really matters less. And I hope I'm not going in too many directions here, but this stuff matters. It does matter. These are things that we need to know well and understand well and appreciate. But I think what's been missing here for the last 15 years is nobody's ever talked about this stuff. So this is the stuff that maybe a super indie crowd cares about. Maybe a Smash crowd cares about. I think ESW, which runs in North Tonawanda, I think they're kind of a hybrid of both. Or maybe they're straddling both, right? You'll have some fans who do connect with this stuff, and you'll have some fans who only need this stuff. But if you want to be a wrestler who's going to start at a place like this, who's going to start from the ground up at the indie level, and you want to make a career for yourself and get traction and get other promotions to care about you, to make your way from Smash to an AIW, to an AAW, to IWC in Pittsburgh, to maybe Limitless in Maine, Beyond Wrestling in the New England area. These are promotions that I would call super indies, and I would call them super indies based on like the criteria of they're making money not just from people in the local area who buy tickets or maybe buy merchandise, but they're making money through, whether it's YouTube revenue, they're making money more from people worldwide. Now, that may not even be the majority of their revenue, but it's still a big piece. And I think that's what separates a local indie from a super indie. A local indie mostly relies on tickets that are sold, especially by the workers who work the show. They're relying on tickets that are sold to people in the local area. And I'm not knocking that at all. That's one way of doing business. That's fine. That's legitimate. And there's another way of doing business, which I would call the super indie model. That is, yes, selling tickets, but also selling video in some form, whether it's VOD, whether it's making ad revenue from YouTube, or whether it's being a part of a VOD service or an SVOD service, a subscription video service like Powerbomb.tv, or before Flow Slam went out of business, and stuff like that. The super indie crowds, the people that are going to get you traction and get you more of a worldwide visibility and get you more on the radar of a WWE or a New Japan or Ring of Honor, I think you need to pay attention to these things. You don't necessarily have to do any of these things, but if you're able to do these things and do them well, this is something that can really get you over with that sort of audience. Does this all make sense so far? So as I was sitting there watching these shows, I started to try to define what are the things that I'm seeing here that get people over that doesn't fit into any of these things. So one of the groups that I wrote down is real feats of athleticism or strength. So examples of that would be, you know who Jeff Cobb is? If you've seen Lucha Underground, he's Matanza in the mask and shit. So Jeff Cobb is a legitimate Olympic wrestler, and he deadlifts people and flings them. And I think the audience, and this will be a pattern, I think the audience wants to see something real, or can certainly appreciate something real. Because I think fans, what's happened in the last 15 years, in large part because of the internet, is people know how much of a work it is now. I think people before, in decades past, in the 90s, 80s, and even before that, people knew that it was a work. But I don't think people knew how much of a work it was, or why it was a work, or just how it was put together. And I think fans have more and more of an idea. They don't know everything, but they have more and more of an understanding, or at least a perceived understanding in themselves of how it's a work. And that really affects the ways in which they respond. So anyway, I think what people want to see ultimately is something real. Now, you can show them a personality that's pretty real and connects with people, but I think when you can do physical things that are real, like if you can deadlift people and pick them up and fling them like Jeff Cobb, or even Dalton Castle does, or you can deadlift German people, right? He can deadlift Super Cop Dick Justice, if you know who that is. He's like 300-400 pounds, I don't know. He can deadlift him, and people, their jaws drop, and they're in awe of when he's able to do that. And those people who can do stuff like that, they set themselves apart from everybody else who can't do that, because that's rare and it's very impressive. So it's not just feats of strength, but athleticism too. So I think an example, Arefox does a lot of things that nobody else can do. He can flip and shit. And I'm not saying that flips are outright good at all times. You gotta flip at the right time and make people care. But if you're able to do something that's athletic, that's agile, in a way that not many other wrestlers in this world can do it, that sets yourself apart from all these other wrestlers who are getting paid $20 who are decent. Or I think when I went to the WrestleCon Super Show at WrestleMania weekend, there were, I think it was like Bandito and Phoenix. They were having a lucha match with it was a tag match with somebody. The point is, if you've ever seen Phoenix, he's jumping up, he's hitting the second rope, the top rope, the second rope, the top rope, he almost falls, he goes back down, and then he jumps off with a fucking arm drag. And it doesn't matter whether or not I like that as a fan, personally, me. What matters is that there's people in that audience who really responded to that in a way of holy shit, he just did something that blew my mind that I know nobody else can do, or at least very few people in wrestling can do. So that's just one. So another one is execution and noise, which is kind of similar to fundamentals, but it's not just your fundamentals that are on that board. So the example that I keep thinking of when I'm talking about execution and noise is I saw Will Ospreay, for example. The speed that he hits the ropes with, the execution that he hits the enziguris with, it's with an intensity and a velocity that's so much different from everybody else. And we can talk about noise too, slapping your leg and shit. Not everybody likes it. Sometimes I don't like it. But the fact is, stuff like that can get over if you do it discreetly enough. And I think fans know, didn't you say I think fans know that this is going on, but they still respond to it. Those very same fans who are well aware that the guy's slapping his leg, those same fans will still respond if it's timed well, or if it's done in a way that doesn't put a lot of stress on my suspension of disbelief. It's done in a way that's discreet enough, it's not very noticeable, and it's really loud, and the kick looks good itself, and people can respond because of that. Bait and switch of common spots. It's a bait and switch. I bait you, here's a spot, and again, we're dealing with wrestling fans who have seen a lot of wrestling, right? fans who are used to seeing a lot of the same sort of sequences over and over, because there's just only so much stuff that we can really do. Fans have seen a lot of the same spots over and over again, and I feel like when you do like a sequence that's 75% of the same stuff that they're used to seeing, but in that last 25%, you give them something that they didn't expect. So like Arefox, again, is the example of, he's been doing a spot I've seen a couple times. He puts a guy in the corner there, and he goes to the other side of the ring, and he's gonna do like the Van Terminator springboard drop kick, coast to coast from one side of the ring to the other. And the guy's selling there, and springboard happens, and guy rolls out and stands right on the floor here, but he's real close to the apron, and Arefox, and this is partly this one too, because he's able to jump so far, but Arefox just jumps even further and does like a baseball slide drop kick through the ropes, and bam. So it's well executed and it's athletic, but it's also a spot that people didn't expect to see. It's like 75% of this spot that people, oh yeah, he's gonna do that thing, and it's gonna get somewhat of a reaction, but wait, oh no, he's not gonna do that, and then oh shit, it did that. Now it's gotten like twice the reaction it would have gotten if they just did the typical spot. And like I said, this is hazardous. I wouldn't recommend only relying on that unless you're gonna be a deathmatch wrestler or some shit, which I wouldn't recommend. I think most of the time, we get confused by all this other stuff when all we really need to do is listen to the crowd. Now, every crowd's gonna be different, but most of the time, like in that situation, people went nuts when he did all that shit. And it doesn't matter if I like it or not. It doesn't matter if anybody individually likes it, but the fact is, the people that were there, which was like over 1,000 people who were paying at least $50 per ticket, lost their fucking minds when he did it. And I think a big mistake that a lot of people inside wrestling, decision makers especially, have made is they've tried to design a wrestling product that's closer to their tastes than it is to creating the product that they have to create to get the most money out of the people, or to deliver the best product. Whatever that means, we could debate for hours what that really means. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that a lot of people don't like, and I think as time goes on, wrestling's gonna get more and more diverse as far as like, it's gonna get more and more niche-y as far as like, oh, I like this kind of wrestling over here. Oh, I don't like that wrestling over here, but I like this wrestling over here. And we can criticize all that stuff, and we can dislike all that stuff, and like all this stuff over here. But the fact is, what gets over, I think, is the rule. Listen to the crowd. If what you do gets over, I think you're doing right, especially if what you're doing is safe too. In fact, it's like, if what you're doing isn't safe, then I guess it doesn't really matter how big of a reaction it is. If you can't do it the next night, then you should probably think about not doing it again. Exceptional toughness, which is kind of like fire, which I think is something that's kind of like selling, and I feel like we don't stress enough what fire is and like what perceived toughness can do for you as a wrestler. Like, as you have practice matches and stuff, we'll talk about firing up. And that's something that can get you so over. And I think it's like a form of selling. It's a later form of selling. Whereas selling, I think, in the 80s and 90s is more about like sympathy and facial expressions, which is really important and foundational. But firing up is something that can really set you apart too and make people care about you, even if they're not modern indie wrestling fans. And then comedy and reference, which I think like, I try not to use examples from our own gym, but like Puff is doing this thing, which is like some sort of dance move that I don't even know, the whip punch. Because he does this shit that people know about, and he incorporates it in a clever way into wrestling, people go crazy for it, even though it's like the simplest. You could, even sometimes I think he throws it too light, and it's like, I don't know what that was supposed to be, but people who know more about whatever he's doing than I do go crazy for it, kind of regardless of the execution of it. Or at least the execution is less important because it connects with them on some sort of like pop culture or cultural level. I think almost all the wrestling shirts in wrestling today are references, they're knockoff shirts, right? Like including my own shirt is like a knockoff of the New York State flag. And there's a ton of knockoff Bullet Club shirts, and like I think half the t-shirts that people put out today are knockoffs of some other brand that people have some affinity to or familiarity with. That's why that stuff continues to be produced, is because it must be working somehow. And it connects with people on some sort of like, oh yeah, cultural level. Yeah. And then again, finishes still matter. I want to emphasize that people still care, despite all this fancy stuff that they want to see, even if they want to see something that makes them feel like what they're watching is in some way real, people still care about seeing their favorite wrestler win. And they don't want to see their favorite wrestler lose. So ultimately, they're there to see somebody win and somebody lose. They're there to see some chapter of a story, some chapter of a larger story, signed off, capped off with a big, well-done, well-executed finish. Because there's nothing that can ruin a match worse than a shitty finish or a botched finish or just a really abrupt, weird finish, you know. And for whatever reason, I've written emotional range here because I think a big thing that I've seen in wrestling is that there's people who can do some of this stuff really well. They don't always have the ability or they don't have easy access to showing a wide range of emotions in that ring or in a promo. They might have a narrow range of facial expressions where anger and pain and happiness and victory all look the same. So have an emotional range. If you don't have a great emotional range, if you don't show me a wide range of emotions in the ring, it's going to limit how many stories you can tell and how over you can get. I don't know if any of this makes sense now, but we'll talk about it later.